I'm John McQuay with 8541 Tactical, and this is Mail Call Mondays, the show that answers your questions about precision rifles, optics, and equipment. We are here on our fourth season of Mail Call Mondays. This is our first episode of 2015, and I want to thank you guys for sticking with us this long. We couldn't have gotten this far without your support, and it still amazes me how many of you guys tune in to see our show. Now, I will apologize that we dropped off a couple of episodes last season. We had the holiday season catch up with us a little bit, and we have been getting ready for a bunch of things here in the shop. So we've kind of gotten behind, but I wanted to make sure that we dropped this first episode of 2015 so you guys know that we are still going and we're planning on making 2015 our best year yet. We've got two things coming up that you guys will see over the next couple of weeks. And again, bear with us. The first thing is next weekend I will be shooting the Mammoth Sniper Challenge down in Blakely, Georgia. That is a 3-day competition where we, meaning me and my partner, we're going to be shooting in the Extreme Tough Man division. So for 3 days we will basically be camping out, and we have to be self-sufficient with the exception of water. We got to carry everything on our backs, all our ammo, all our gears, our rifles, our tents, sleeping bags, all that stuff that we need for the whole time we're going to be out there, with the exception of water. And they'll allow us to stock some food in a small limited size cooler that we can resupply with nightly. But all the other stuff, it's got to be on our backs. So it's going to be a really interesting experience. I went ahead and picked up an Eberlestock Gunslinger 2. I already have an Eberlestock X3 low drag pack, which I use as my general range bag, but that pack is just a little bit too small to be able to do this deal. In all truth, the Gunslinger 2 is actually probably a little bit too small, but I really wanted to limit myself on what I brought. I have this bad habit of, if I have a large pack, I will try to fill it. And in this match, we will actually have to make time hacks between the different checkpoints. We'll have to carry everything between each stage, and we will have to make better than 18 minutes a mile between those stages. And they have some other rules that we'll cover later on when we talk about that match. So it's really taken a lot to get my gear set up, because I haven't shot a match like this in quite a few years. In fact, I really haven't operated like this since I left the Marine Corps and had to carry all my stuff on my back then. And that wasn't something I really enjoyed then, so this has taken a little bit of convincing to get me to decide to do this one. So we'll see how it goes. Now, enough rambling on that. Let's get to our topic for this week's show. The rifle sitting in front of me causes controversy every time I post pictures or videos of it. This is a Remington 700. It's the old AAC SD. It's a 308 1-in-10 twist barrel. 20-inch barrel, and we have a Thunderbeast Arms 30P1 suppressor with an Armageddon Gear suppressor cover on it. Both items that have worked extremely well in the past. The big noticeable part of this rifle is the Cadex Strike 30 chassis system that it is sitting in. And mounted on top of it, we have a Spur ISMS scope mount system with a Bushnell Elite Tactical XRS 4.5 to 30 power rifle scope. Now, the part that causes controversy is how high the scope is mounted over the bore of the rifle. It always brings up comments about, does this cause a problem? Isn't this an issue? Shouldn't you have your scope mounted as close to the barrel as possible? Well, there are a couple of ways that you need to address this. First of all, I'm going to categorically state on this rifle, the height of the optic over the bore is not a problem in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it is exactly where it needs to be. The reason that the scope is where it needs to be on this rifle is the Cadex Strike 30 has an integrated 20 MOA rail system in the top of the chassis here. It is a continuous rail. It is actually two separate pieces, but the rail is continuous and is the same angle for the entire length of the rail. This base here is the height that it is because we can't sink the rail down any further into the tube up front here. So if we're going to keep that 20-minute angle cant, and we can't move the front down, we have to move the back up. And when we do so, we get this almost 1-inch height on the back of the scope base. This in turn, since we have a one-piece rail here, requires that we use an AR height mounting system like the Spur ISMS that allows us to mount our scope with this big old objective and still clear. We still have enough room to put scope caps on here. We still have enough room that the bell is not getting jacked up on the rail. So that makes everything up high. Now, the reason it's not a problem on this system is we have a fully adjustable buttstock back here. We have a cheek piece that I can put below the bore, or I can crank it all the way up here to as high as I need it to go. I could probably mount an old Starlight scope on top of here and still crank this cheek piece up high enough to meet my needs. I wouldn't actually do that. I hate those scopes. They're big and heavy and they make things want to flip over. But should I desire to do so, I could probably do it with this chassis. Now, in addition to that, when we crank this cheek piece up to get that perfect cheek weld, that then affects the geometry between our cheek and our shoulder. So I really like to have an adjustable butt pad as well. And on this chassis, we do have the adjustable butt pad, and I have it raised up until the heel of the butt pad is almost even with the comb of the stock. That's where I prefer it for prone shooting. It also seems to work very well for just about any other position that I get into. So with this chassis, since we're fully adjustable, we're able to overcome this height over bore, and we're able to get the rifle dialed in. Now let's talk specifically about height over bore. When we're talking about height over bore, we're talking about the distance, in fact, between the center of the bore of the rifle and the center of the scope tube on the rifle. And that distance is the distance that you'll plug in for sight height or height over bore in your ballistic computer or when you do your ballistic calculations. On a Remington, it's fairly easy to measure. You go to the pressure relief hole that's in the side of the receiver, and on a standard scope mount like our LaRue mount or some of the other ones out there that use horizontally split rings, you just measure to the ring split. So from the pressure relief hole to the ring split, and that will give you your sight height or your height over bore. Now with the Spur ISMS, we have a slant cut to the scope ring, so we can't really do that. So on that, you just kind of eyeball the center line here. On the Spur, there are actually mounting holes that will give you an idea of where the center of the scope tube is. So you can eyeball it there, and all you need to do is get it close. If you're off by 1/10 of an inch, it's not going to make a massive amount of difference. And we'll talk about why that is here in just a minute. Now, let's talk about the old thought, the old school thought on it. It used to be that when guys started talking about mounting their scopes, and you've even seen us discuss it in some of our previous videos, you want to get that scope as close to the bore as possible. Well, it's not actually the sight height that we're worried about. What we're worried about is the cheek on the comb. Now, back in the day when stocks like this were commonplace, not these wonderful plastic stocks, but wood stocks that are in this shape, standard hunting style stocks, we really didn't have a choice on our cheek weld. So if you picture where the center line of the bore would be on this stock, you see that if we bring that scope up really high, then we don't have anywhere to put our cheek. Our cheek's floating around up here, and you're not going to get a consistent cheek weld. So we have one of two options. You either mount the scope as low as you can mount the scope, or you start strapping stuff on the stock here to build it up to put your eye where it needs to be. And you'll still go out on the web nowadays and you'll see guys that take stocks like this. This is the original stock off the AAC SD. It's a Hogue overmolded stock. You'll see guys take rifles with stocks like this and they'll put AR height rings on it. The only reason that I can think this is because if you go out and you put AR height rings, you know your scope bell is going to clear the barrel. You're not going to have any issues. The counter guy at Gander Mountain or wherever you're buying stuff, Walmart, whatever, he can tell you, oh, buy these scope rings and toss you a set of high or extra high rings, and you know they're going to fit. The guy's going to be able to put them on, and he's not going to come back and say my scope won't fit on my rifle. That is not the best thing for accuracy, because your face will be floating around back here and you won't be able to get precise shot groups. If your eyeball is moving around behind that scope, or your cheek is moving around on the scope, then any little bit of parallax is going to throw your shots off pretty bad. So you want a solid cheek weld. Now, the cheapest way to get a solid cheek weld with one of these stocks is just to start taping foam to the back of your stock with rigger's tape. Or you can go with something like a Bradley B24 cheek piece, which is a Kydex cheek piece that will strap on here. It gives you a little bit more rigidity. Or the old school favorite is the stock pack, like you can get from Triad Tactical, or there's still some Eagle stock packs floating around there. And you can strap those on and get your sight height set up, your cheek weld set up with that. So that is really where the old get your scope as close to the bore as possible comes from. With these systems, again, it really doesn't matter, because I can crank this cheek piece up and I can crank the butt pad up to get my face exactly where I need it behind the scope. Now, it can become an issue because this rifle right here, I have to be very selective in what kind of rifle cases I fit it in. In fact, a friend just gave me a nice long rifle case that he wasn't using that I thought was going to be perfect for transporting this to the range in the bed of the truck. The length is great. The rifle will fit in as far as the length, but the scope height is too high. I can't actually get the case closed with the scope in it. So you do run into problems like that. It makes things really interesting dropping this into my Everly Stock X3, because the distance between the pistol grip and the scope cap up here is just so great that it wants to jam into the side of the bag. So you can run into other problems with running your scope high, but again, on this system, that's the only choice. You can't push the scope any lower unless you decide to go with a scope with a smaller objective bell. Now let's talk about the math real quick with our sight height or height over bore. What we need to do with this factor, once we've got the stock set up for the ergonomics so that we have a correct eye position behind the scope, and we get a comfortable and consistent cheek weld, and the butt pad is comfortable on our stock, we still need to address the sight height for our ballistic calculations. Now, real quickly, let me touch on zero, because it is going to come into our discussion here in just a minute. For precision rifles, I recommend guys go with a 100-yard zero. And what I mean with these rifles by zero is that you set your turrets at zero at 100 yards. Zero is really a strange concept when we get into precision rifles that have precision adjustments on the scope turret. Because the reality of the situation is, if I go out to the range and I have this rifle zeroed at 100 yards, so the scope cap is set on zero when my point of impact and point of aim coincide at 100 yards. If all of a sudden I decide that I want to hit a target at 200 yards, so I want to dial my point of aim and point of impact to 200 yards. On this scope, I'm going to come up 5/10 of a mil, or 5 clicks on this scope. So I come up 5/10 of a mil. I now, for all intents and purposes, have a 200-yard zero. Now, say for this rifle that I need to dial 1.5 mils to hit a 300-yard target. Well, I just dial 1.5 on here, and my scope is now zeroed for 300 yards. I recommend you start with the zero at 100 yards on these rifles, because if you're running a scope like this that is equipped with a zero stop, then with your zero set at 100 yards, you will always dial up. No matter if you're engaging a target at 300 yards or you're engaging a target at 3 yards, you will always dial up on the scope. Now, this is counterintuitive, and I find a lot of guys don't understand this, because it's understandable that if we zero at 100 yards, as we shoot targets further out, that bullet is dropping. So we need to dial elevation up to maintain our point of aim and point of impact coinciding. Well, since we always dial up when we are going out in range, some guys seem to think that when we come back in, that now we're going to dial down. And this is not true. And the reason that this doesn't work is because of the angles that we're working with here. The scope is mounted above the bore of the rifle, and so the scope has to be angled down, or the line of sight has to be angled down to coincide with the point of impact at 100 yards. So while the bullet isn't rising, the bullet is always dropping when it leaves the muzzle. That drop is so small that we have to angle the scope to maintain our point of aim and point of impact at 100 yards. So since the bullet is always below the line of sight until we hit that 100-yard zero, we still need to dial up on the scope to maintain that point of aim and point of impact when we come in. So how does that relate to our sight height? Well, we did a couple of examples here, and I'll run through them real quick. We used a 3-inch sight height and a 1.75-inch sight height. Those will give you an idea of some of the differences that we're looking at. I believe the reason I used 1.75 was that was the default in my ballistic calculator. It's going to be somewhere between 1.5 and 1.75. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is how drastic the change is. We're almost using 2 times the difference in sight height. So 1.75 and 3 inches, that's about 1.25 inches difference between the two. But it's a drastic difference between the two. Now, if we take a representative rifle shooting M118 LR and we have it zeroed for 100 yards, if we go out to shoot a 1,000-yard target with the rifle with a 3-inch sight height, we're going to need to dial on 11.2 mils on our scope, and we're going to have to come up about 395.3 inches. If we compare that with the same rifle shooting M118 LR, but we lower our scope down to a 1.75-inch sight height, we would then need 11.5 mils or 406.6 inches to maintain our point of aim and point of impact, or to impact that target at 1,000 yards. So that's a difference of 11.3 inches or 0.3 mils. Now really I want you to look at the mils here. 0.3 mils is not a whole lot when we're talking about the range of adjustment that we need. So 0.3 mils out of 11.2 mils needed to get there is not huge. But the 1.7-inch sight height is actually going to require more adjustment to get out there than the 3-inch. And it's just the angles that we're playing with. Now let's switch to inside of our zero. Now when we come inside our zero, the 3-inch sight height, if we're trying to hit a target at 25 yards with a 100-yard zero, then we're going to need to dial up 2 mils or come up 1.7 inches. So we'll actually dial up on a rifle scope, remember, because that bullet is still below the line of sight. We'll dial up on a rifle sight 2 mils. Now if we look at our 1.75-inch sight height example at 25 yards, again with a 100-yard zero, we'll have to dial on 0.9 mils or 0.8 inches. So we need to come up 0.8 inches at 25 yards. The interesting thing to see here is that now with the 1.75-inch we have less adjustment that we need to make, because that scope is closer to the bore. So the bullet is starting out closer to your line of sight. So it's really interesting to see how the angles come into play here. But now we're talking about a very drastic sight alteration. We're talking about 0.9 inches difference between the two. So when you're shooting out to a great distance, it's easy to compensate for that comparatively little bit of change. When you're shooting extreme close range for a surgical shot or a surgical stage at a competition, you have a much greater change between those sight heights. So you need to make sure that you get that sight height pretty close. Again, within 1/10, you're going to be fine. You don't really have to break out the calipers. A ruler is sufficient. But you don't want to just roll with the default values. You want to actually plug in the correct value for your rifle. Now it gets kind of baffling, but you know, it's really an interesting thing to take a look at on your rifle. And I do encourage you to go out to the range, get your rifle zeroed at 100 yards, and then shoot long range and shoot short range. Now, the disadvantage is with a rifle scope like this, where we're using a high magnification scope, you will generally not get a clear sight picture at that 25-yard range. You may not even be able to get a clear sight picture at 50 yards. Usually the parallax does not go down that far, so you'll need to make sure that you get a really good cheek weld. You'll notice that when you bob your head around behind it, you can have quite a bit of parallax in the system depending upon what rifle scope you have. So that crosshair will really want to jump around in relation to the target if you are shooting extremely close. Your target will also be blurry. You'll probably be able to get a clear picture on your crosshair because that should be dialed in no matter what the distance the target is. But your actual target image will be fairly blurry with a high magnification scope. So you'll need to kind of shoot for the center of the blur. But you'll notice some really interesting things going on, and those values for your close range zero are really something that you need to write down in your data book, because they can be extremely useful if a match director decides to throw a surgical stage at you and make you shoot little tiny dots really close in. It just is humbling to see how many guys miss those little tiny dots close in, and I've done it as well. I've gone into a match, a local match, shooting a rifle that I had not shot close range with and didn't know what the close range dope was, and it was off just enough that I wasn't able to hit that dot. So I hope that clears up a little bit of the confusion on sight height and close range shooting and zero in general. If you guys have any questions on it, please send me comments in the comments section below or send them to us on Facebook or Twitter. If you like the video, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Now, we do have a bunch of stuff coming up. We've got a couple of review videos that we have to finish up. For the Mammoth Sniper Challenge, because it is very, very weight sensitive, I'm not bringing regular video gear. I'm going to bring a still camera. I'm going to take some notes, and I will come back and give you guys an after action report after we get back from that. We will also be heading out to SHOT Show the weekend following that. So I don't know that we're going to be able to get a show in next week. We will do our best to try, but I will be unpacking gear from that and getting ready for SHOT. So things will really be moving at about Mach 10 here. Again, if you guys have any questions or comments, or if there's anything specific that you want to see for the SHOT Show, please go ahead and post it in the comments below. Thank you for sticking with us for as long as you have, and until next time, get out and shoot!